was a great video, and what makes it even funnier is the fact that Rob actually had LASIK 3 years ago, so when he wears his glasses, it's just for fun. It's like the comfort of wearing glasses. But anyway, it's a good video, and focus. It's what we've been talking about. We've been in this series for 5 weeks, and we've just come off of Thanksgiving. I hope everybody had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I know my family did. We were over in the valley. We actually did Thanksgiving a little different this year. We decided to do just charcuterie style Thanksgiving. So we just had like massive grazing board. My dad made some ham and turkey, but he just put it in a crock pot, and it was like eat when you want type Thanksgiving. But it worked out good. We have lots of little kids in our family, so everyone was happy. You could eat when you were hungry, nap time when it was nap time. All was good. We even fit in a 3-mile hike because that is how we do Thanksgiving. Could have been longer, but it was fun. We had a really great time. Glad to be back today, though. And as I said, this is week 5 of our Focus series. We've talked about so many things worthy of our attention in life. We've talked about managing money with a godly mindset. We've talked about heaven. We've talked about character and mentorship. And all of these things, to have the right focus in life, it takes work. I remember, back in middle school when they would teach you how to use a microscope and to focus it. I was never good at it. I would always have my lab partner do it all the way through college, actually. I'm just like, too many knobs to turn. Focus is hard. I mean, think of it as hard as it is with a microscope. It's even harder when we're in the busyness of life. It takes intention and work. My grandpa, who actually snuck in today, they didn't tell me they were coming, has a quote that I love, and he says about focus that it's shutting out the non-essential for the sake of the critical. Shutting out the non-essential for the sake of the critical. So what is the critical? Over all these things that demand our focus, what is most important? Where should my focus really be? And life can be so distracting, especially now that we're in the holiday season. There's so many things that demand our attention. Maybe it's presents you need to buy, or meals you need to plan, or events you gotta go to, or kids' concerts, and all of these things, they start demanding our attention, and they come at us, and we have to figure out how they fit in our schedule. And the noise of it all can feel like a lot, right? It's just coming at us all the time. How do we deal with this input? How do we have focus when life feels like that? Well, in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, we're told to give Jesus our focus because he is the author and the perfecter of our faith. And a main point of our message today is that we choose to focus on Jesus because we ultimately sink when we focus anywhere else. And that maybe sounds a little bit harsh, but it's one of those things that's definitely true. Anything else that demands our focus will not sustain us. But how motivated are we to find Jesus in the busyness of our lives? How am I able to do this? How am I motivated? Is it even worth it for me to try to make Jesus my daily focus? There's a specific story in the life of Peter that I think really represents this idea of the importance of our focus being on Jesus. And I think it's something we can apply to our lives as well. When Jesus walked the earth, he was a major character. He was something that people wanted to focus on. Jesus was like a celebrity. You always hear about the crowd. There's always a crowd following Jesus, trying to get near Jesus. They wanted to see what miracle he was going to do next. Maybe they needed a healing in their own life. Maybe they were inspired by his teaching, or maybe they were just curious, or maybe they even followed him because they didn't like what he was doing. Either way, Jesus had people drawing to him, coming around him. And Peter, in this story, he is going to be drawn to turn his focus to Jesus in an unlikely situation. If you turn to Matthew chapter 14, we're going to start at verse 22. And it says, immediately after this, well, what was this? It was Jesus feeding the 5,000. So Jesus has just done this massive miracle. He's fed all these people with leftovers to spare. Jesus insists that his disciples get back into a boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there all alone. If we continue on in verse 24, it says, meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble, far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. So Jesus has done this amazing miracle. He sends his disciples out. Jesus knows everything. He probably knows they're going to go into a storm, and we kind of have to ask, why did Jesus send them into the storm? I don't necessarily have all the answers. I know Rob has given a message on this before, and there's different times where storms in our lives can reveal different things, storms of perfection and storms of correction. Possibly Jesus is seeing where his disciples' focus is in this storm. But the disciples, they're in a tough situation. They're trying to manage their boat and the weather, and in this moment, their focus isn't necessarily on Jesus, which makes sense. At the time that the disciples are walking with Jesus, he is fully God, but he's also a man, limited in this time to one location. So they're probably not really thinking about where Jesus is a whole lot, because he's somewhere off away from them. He's not with them in the boat. And their attention is on the problem at hand, the wind, the waves, the water coming up, getting in their face. It's demanding their energy and their focus. And in life, we can be task-focused people. I know I am. I tend to be a task-focused, problem-solving type person. And a lot of times those can be good qualities. But when we're motivated to fix a problem on our own, we might be oblivious to the fact that there might be something else even better, possibly beyond our own strength. Are we trying to fix our own problems, missing out on the fact that there might be a solution out there that we haven't considered? And Jesus is about to do something that I don't think the disciples probably had considered in this situation where they're fighting the storm. And in verse 25, it says, at about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. Now, if you've grown up in church and you've read this story a lot, you're like, okay, yeah, we know the Jesus walking on the water story, but this is weird. If you think about the reality of being in a boat and they see a figure coming toward them, this would be very shocking. This would be really strange. They would have no idea what is going on. So their response in verse 26 makes perfect sense. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. And in their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost." I mean, that's all they could think of what it would be. Who else is going to be out there in this storm on the water? Because they're stressed. They're at the end of their ropes. They've come off of a spiritual high. And isn't it interesting how sometimes in our lives when we experience like this awesome moment, probably spiritually, to then crash. Something negative happens. Something hard happens. We have to walk through this tough situation, and we just feel that in life they're going through this. And they're interpreting, what they're seeing, instead of what they're seeing being a potential positive, what they're seeing out there on the water, they're interpreting as negative. Their fear has taken hold of them, and they're assuming the worst. I can tend to be a glass half empty person, especially when I'm facing stress. That's why it's nice to be married to Rob, because he's definitely the glass half full person in our relationship, and it balances us out. But the disciples, they're focused on the storm and their fear, and this scary thing is out there, and they're feeling the worst. But in verse 27, Jesus speaks to them and says, "Don't be afraid. Take courage. I'm here." Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you, walking on the water." Now it's stormy. They're probably yelling this conversation. It's probably not super peaceful. There's noise and waves and things going on, and they're having this conversation with the storm still continuing. And I think that's interesting to think about that. The storm hasn't stopped at this point. But the fact that Jesus is now in the equation has shifted Peter's focus completely, where it's not the storm demanding his attention anymore, but he's now looking and talking to Jesus. So what if in our lives, what if we factored Jesus into the situations that we face in life? How would that shift our focus? How would things change if we did that? I remember a really disappointing time in my life when it was hard to focus on Jesus. I was a teacher actually at West Albany High School, and I loved it. I was teaching high school. It was a ton of fun. The students liked me. My principal liked me. But I got that job because another teacher had resigned 1 month into the school year, and they suddenly needed a teacher. So I got brought in, but was technically given a contract just for that year. It was like just to fill out that. But by the second half of the year, I was like, oh, I really like it here. I would love to stay on. And I started asking the lead of my department, hey, do you think they'll have a contract for me? Do you think they'll have a contract? And he would be like, well, I don't know. We don't have enrollment numbers yet. They were never sure. And at a staff meeting, about 2 months from the end of the school year, the principal announces, let's all thank Maggie for filling in here because she won't be here next year. And I was devastated. I was like, not only do I not get to teach here next year, you announced it into front of the whole staff. And that was really disappointing. I remember feeling like, Lord, what am I going to do? This job really helped us out with our income. It was really comfortable. I had a lot of fun. What now? I'm kind of sinking, kind of stuck. But my focus was wrapped up into what I was doing. Because that's another fault I can tend to have, where I get a little too much of my identity out of what I'm doing instead of remembering that that's not where that comes from. And when those storms in life come, especially if you're a person that, can get a lot of fulfillment out of your job, when that starts to get rocky, we feel a little like we're sinking. And we wonder what's going on. And we have to consider where our focus has been. But in this conversation that Peter's having with Jesus, in verse 29, Jesus responds to Peter, yes, come. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified, and he began to sink. Save me, Lord, he shouted. Peter was focused on Jesus. He was able to do something amazing, walk on the water. We don't know how far, but it's not the waves that defeated Peter, because he was choosing to walk amidst the storm. But it was when he shifted his attention, his lack of sustained focus on Jesus is what leads to Peter sinking. He allows his attention to shift in the middle of the storm, but then when he shifts it back off of where it's supposed to go, he sinks. We choose to focus on Jesus because we ultimately sink when we focus anywhere else. I was reading a devotional lately written by a mom who walked through a long adoption journey, and she wrote, everything on this earth is shaky, but our God cannot be shaken. When I can refocus on the greatness of my God, my crisis turns into an opportunity to trust and lean on him, because I remember that he can handle what I cannot. And that is why we choose to focus on Jesus, on what Jesus can do, because it shifts. What miraculous things could I be a part of in life if my full attention is on Jesus? Not out of selfish gain, but for the fact that when our attention is on Jesus, the impossible can become possible. It changes things. And though Peter lost his focus and began to sink, Jesus doesn't just let go of him and say, tough for you. No, it says in verse 31, Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. You have so little faith, Jesus said. Why did you doubt me? And when they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Unfortunately, we know this story almost more for the fact that Peter sinks rather than the fact that Peter did something amazing, the walking on the water. His failure to focus kind of becomes the legacy of the story. And I was thinking about myself this week and I don't want my failure to focus to be a legacy of my story. I want to get this right. I want to know how to really focus on Jesus. And I think that kind of ties into what Rob talked about a few weeks ago with the heaven analogy and the rope, and how we get so concerned about our lifespan that's really just one tiny piece of the rope that extends on forever. And that what really matters in life is the decisions that impact eternity. Because so many things, not just negatives, not just storms, can steal our focus, but our goals, even positive things, our own comfort, love, money, success, they can all steal our focus. There's actually a great quote from Jim Carrey that I stumbled on, and he said, "I hope everybody could get rich and famous and have everything they ever dreamed of, so they will know it's not the answer." That everything we chase in life, it eventually wears out. And I think, at Christmas time, that's a time where, especially as kids, we think about all the things that we want and what we're so excited to get at Christmas time. I remember back in 2007, I think this was probably the thing I wanted most of all the Christmases in my life. I had to have a pair of Uggs. Like Uggs, this is when Uggs came out. Like they were big. Everybody had Uggs and they were so great. They were like the multi-purpose boot. You wore them all year long. You could wear them with a mini skirt. You could wear them with your sweatpants. You could wear them with your jeans. I wore them with my cheer uniform. I wore them all the time, and I loved them, and I wanted them so bad. And I got them for Christmas, and I did. I wore those Uggs for 15 years. They held up. They held up. Just about, I think it was only 2.5 years ago, I finally threw them away. I mean, I did have other pairs, but those were like the first ones, and I loved them, and I held on to them. But eventually they became garbage. Just like kind of everything does, unfortunately. You think whatever, you're so excited to get whatever makes you happy in 15 years is garbage. Like it's just the reality. Everything loses its draw. We get bored or we move on or it gets old. Nothing can keep us sustained. Anything that's not Jesus, it ends up wearing out. But maybe material things aren't the draw for you. Maybe it's something else. Some of us like to have the latest information and know what's going on. Some of us can be addicted to the news, which frankly can be negative a lot of the time. And even that wears out. And Ecclesiastes tells us, even knowing everything, even the pursuit of knowledge is meaningless compared to knowing God. That nothing can fulfill us that same way. So the things of the world, if they aren't worth my attention, but Jesus is, it's because Jesus is where we find peace and hope and joy and strength and purpose and our true identity, because focus on Jesus illuminates life. It illuminates our life. And that's our theme going into Christmas this year. Next week, we kick off our Illuminate series because we want to communicate the message that Jesus is the light of the world. And that is the reason for the season. That is what we should be chasing. Jesus brings light to our lives. I think of that scene in the original Wizard of Oz when Dorothy, to this point, has been living in a black and white world, and she suddenly steps out in Munchkin land, and everything's in color. I feel like that is what it's like when we really let Jesus be our focus, because we're now able to see clearly. We're able to see possibilities maybe we hadn't considered before, and life takes a dramatic shift when we put our attention in the right place. So it sounds nice to say, focus on Jesus. We probably all agree that's a good thing. But how do we practically do that? What does that look like? We had a great discussion in our message team about this idea. If you didn't know, every message that's communicated from this platform is shared with a team on Monday that helps us be better. They ask us questions, they give us insight, we practice our message, we run through it, and that team is so important to what we do here because we are a we over me culture for our team at Redmond Assembly. That's really important to us to work together. So we had this discussion of, what does that mean to be truly Jesus focused? Do you just only watch The Chosen? Do you only listen to Christian music? Do you only wear church merch? How does this practically play out in life? And this could be a whole other message, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul gives a great discussion about things that are permissible but not beneficial. And really it comes down to using wisdom in life to know if the choices we're making, are they drawing us closer to Jesus or are they taking us further from Jesus? Because it's not about being a Pharisee or a monk or following all these religious rules, but it's about where our heart and our attention is going. So I think there's two practical things that we can do this week to really try to focus on Jesus. And the first one is to slow down. To slow down. You know, often when we're hustling through life, we can feel like Jesus is just nowhere. I can't hear him. But when we slow down and we add a little space into our day, that word nowhere can become now here with just a little space. Jesus is now here. And it takes us slowing down and making time to see that sometimes. In Matthew 14:27, Jesus speaks to them, "Don't be afraid, take courage, I am here." In the midst of the storm, Peter has this conversation with Jesus. And Jesus, for us, he's always accessible. He's not limited to one location. In the midst of whatever we're facing, we have the ability to reach out and have a conversation with Jesus. We have to slow down sometimes when we're praying to listen to what Jesus might be saying back to us. So this week, let's slow down. Let's add a little breath and exhale into our busy lives. I was reading an article this week that wasn't necessarily Christian in nature, but it got my attention, and the article talked about there's two types of exhale. A deep breath that softens us and helps us let go of all that came before and all that we've been carrying. And the second kind of exhale helps us muster some focus, some strength, some here goes nothing gumption for what fuels us for what's next. But I think we can take that with a biblical perspective of what if we had some intentional exhales this week, moments to just breathe, to say, Jesus, I give this burden to you. Or Jesus, I need your strength to do whatever it might be, fill in the blank, to help us focus in on what matters. So we got to slow down. But number two, we also need to turn our eyes. How do we do this? Well, there might need to be some actual physical turning away from. Maybe you know there's something you're consuming in your life that's not helpful to you, some sort of media that you might need to turn your eyes literally away from. Or maybe it's more of a work-life balance, or maybe it's just distraction that you know you're aware of. Maybe it involves repenting, because repenting is we've been going our way and we turn to go Jesus's way. Maybe that's the kind of turning of focus we need to have. Or maybe it's turning to the Word, adding time in our day to do that, turning to prayer or to worship. Whatever it may be for you, let's turn our eyes so that we're really giving Jesus our focus, so we don't miss what he might be doing in our own confusion with the storms of life. You know, there's a fantastic hymn, probably my favorite hymn, that is called Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. And I kind of dove into the backstory of this hymn because I kept thinking about it this week as I was writing this message. And this hymn was actually written by two different women. It really came about in phases. The first writer, her name was Lilias Trotter, and she actually wrote a poem. Her poem was called Focused, a Story and a Song. She was born in 1853 in London, and she was actually a very talented painter. She could have had a great career, some people say, but she believed in Jesus, and she felt called to Africa, specifically to Algeria. And she's a single woman, so no one wanted to support her. No church funded her. Nobody was giving to her cause, and yet she went. She goes to Africa by herself, and she serves, and she ministers, and while she is there, she writes a poem. And the last stanza of that poem says, "Turn full your soul's vision to Jesus, and look at him, and a strange dimness will come over all that is apart from him. And the divine, a trait, which means attraction, by which God's saints are made, even in this 20th century, will lay hold of you, for he is worthy to have all there is to be had and the heart that he has died to win. So she writes this poem in Africa, and this poem makes its way into a missionary pamphlet that comes to the United States, and that pamphlet is read by a woman named Helen Lemmel. She reads this in 1918, and Helen was a gifted musician. She had been classically trained in Germany with her husband. They had been married, but Helen got sick. She got a disease that left her blind, and her husband left her. Helen was left. You think life circumstances would have dragged these women down. They both faced some hard things. A woman called to another continent in a time period where that was really weird and socially not acceptable. Another woman who was amazingly gifted but was devastatingly deserted by her husband. They walked through hardship, and yet their storms did not sink them, because their focus was on Jesus. Because Helen, she hears that poem and she goes on to write the hymn that we are familiar with today. And how fascinating it is that she writes a song about turning our eyes on Jesus, yet she is blind. You know, she knows that it's more than just our physical eyes, but our attention in life. And she did so many other things. She was a part of the Billy Sunday outreach efforts. If you've never heard of Billy Sunday, he was a very popular evangelist in this time period, had been a pro baseball player, goes on to become an evangelist. She taught music at the Moody Bible Institute, and she penned over 400 hymns. And her legacy lives on today. Man, the things of earth, they grow strangely dim, like Helen writes. Because when we turn our attention to Jesus, suddenly those other things become less important. That financial struggle, that decision, that addiction, that shortcoming, that fear, that lie, it all dims. It becomes like a flattened wave, a surface that we're not afraid to walk on or go through because our focus is where it's supposed to be. A focus that helps illuminate our lives and the new possibilities that we can see. Because we see Jesus. We can see his hand in our life. We can see his grace. We can see hope. We can see future. And we can see the promise of eternity. So to conclude, like these amazing women who brought this song to life, to live a life well lived, we have to focus on Jesus. And as I mentioned before, Hebrews 12:2 tells us to put our attention on Jesus, who's the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. But what it's saying is it's what enables us to run with endurance the race that sets before us. That true focus is what allows us to really accomplish all that we're called to do in this life. And it's not about our perfection. We're gonna fail, we're gonna make mistakes, but it's about our direction. Where are we focused? Where are we headed? What are we pursuing? That's what matters. You know, I was a cheerleader in high school, and then I was a coach for several years. And there's this stunt dismount that I used to do as an athlete and I used to coach, and it's called a full down. And you spin as an athlete when you're getting tossed out of the air and caught. And the only way to do this stunt correctly is to make sure that your eyes go the direction your body needs to spin. So if I'm supposed to spin this way to come down, it's my head that helps turn my body. If I try to do this and I look over here and my body's trying to go that way, that doesn't work. I'm gonna fall on somebody's head and we're all gonna get hurt. And in life, it's kind of the same way, that our attention, our focus, it moves where we're going. And in order to really be effective, honestly, a lot of times in order to really be safe, where our gaze is going is gonna direct the whole rest of our body. It's gonna overtake our circumstances. And in order for us to really be effective, our focus has to go the right direction. And for us as believers, that's to focus on Jesus. Or maybe you're hearing this for the first time and you're feeling your heart pinged of, I haven't tried that yet in life. Well, I dare you to try it. Give Jesus your focus, because life's better, it's illuminated when that's where we look. And if we think about Lilius and Helen, the authors of the song, their life wasn't easy. They had a lot of struggle. They went through a lot, but their life was full and meaningful, and they were able to run with endurance because their focus was in the right place. If you could grab that connection card, hopefully you received it on the way in. We always have a way to respond because we believe that truth demands a response. And the first box on that connection card is, I choose to follow Jesus for the first time. And maybe that's you today, that's not a decision you've made before to give Jesus your focus. And maybe you're gonna make that decision today. Or number two, I admit a lot of my focus is distracted from Jesus. I think we've all been there. Life just wants to demand a lot from us. But recognizing that you've been distracted is a good place to start. Or maybe it's number three, I want to slow down and live a life well lived, focusing on Jesus. Maybe you're going to try one of those things this week to add a little pause, add a little exhale and slow down. Or maybe to turn your eyes back where they're supposed to go. Or number four, I'm thankful that God is not shaken by my circumstances. Jesus wasn't shaken by the storm or the disciples' fear or lack of focus, because he's greater than all of that. And as we close today, we are going to close with the song, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. And I just encourage you to make that your prayer as we go into this week.